There we go. Ready to go? Absolutely. Okay, let me do my little intro and then I'll pass it off to you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ames Public Library, both in person and virtually for Genealogy Plus, a program brought to you through a partnership with Ames Public Library and the Story County Genealogical Society. I'm Megan Klein-Hewitt, Adult Services Manager here at Ames Public Library. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through diverse and inclusive resources and programming like today's event. For those of you with us in person, the room is equipped with an induction loop for the benefit of hearing aid users. To use that, please switch your hearing aid to T. We also have a hearing assist device that we can lend you. If you are interested, just let me know. For those of you with us virtually, please mute your microphones during the presentation and submit your questions via the chat function, which you should find a link to at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring the chat to make sure your questions get shared with our speaker when appropriate, and there'll be time for questions at the end of the session as well. If you get bumped out of the Zoom meeting, just follow that original link back. You can get right back in. And for everyone, today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Ames Public Library YouTube channel after the event. And as I said, we will have time for questions at the end. If you're on Zoom, I will read those questions out for you. And if you're with us live, I will try to run around with the microphone, but if I don't get one, Allie will repeat your question so that folks at home can hear. And with that, please welcome Allie Shambaugh-Miller. Hi, everyone. Are you able to hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So my name is Allie Shambaugh-Miller. I am a senior at Drake University, which is in Des Moines. I am double majoring in history and sociology. And today I'm just really excited to talk to you about some research that I was able to do as an undergrad through an internship program, focusing on the Underground Railroad in central Iowa. This also included some work with the National Park Service and their program, the Network to Freedom. It was a really cool collaborative project, and I'm just really excited to talk to you guys about it today. So I did this research in 2021, and with a team of a mentor who was a local genealogist, Ricky King, and another high school student, we researched 15 individuals buried in Woodland Cemetery, which is the oldest cemetery in Des Moines. All of these individuals, what we were trying to do was to verify their Underground Railroad association, either as a conductor or a freedom seeker. And then this research culminated in the nomination and acceptance of Woodland to the National Park Service Network to Freedom, which I'll talk more about. When I give presentations about this research, which I was mostly doing during COVID, I typically provide some background on the internship that I did, the Network to Freedom. Then I talk about Woodland Cemetery and a background of the Underground Railroad in Iowa. But today I also really want to focus in on what research methods my team used. I think that would be more interesting to you guys, since I'm sure a lot of you do your own research yourself. A lot of the resources that I'm going to be talking about are ones that you've probably also encountered. So I just kind of want to walk you through my research from the beginning to the end of locating these individuals, verifying their association, and writing their biographies. Oh, is this working? Does it really? There has to be one problem with the presentation. Oh, you got it, of course. So just to begin, if I were to ask you all right now where you thought the Underground Railroad was, and I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to make you all participate, but I imagine that most of your answers would be the general region of the South up into the Northeast. So states like Alabama, Georgia, Virginia are ones that are going to come to mind. And I can guess which state probably does not come to mind. And that is our great state of Iowa. So when I tell people that I am researching the Underground Railroad in Iowa, they typically kind of meet me with this like polite blank stare. And then they ask me, well, what does Iowa really have to do with the Underground Railroad? And I couldn't really answer that question when I started my research in 2021. But I found out that Iowa really has this rich Underground Railroad history that I think really needs to be brought to the forefront. Just a little preview of my presentation. First, we're going to start out with the project background of what I did. Then I'll delve into the Iowa history. Finally, I'm going to walk you through my research process using the biographies of Henry and Jenny Bell, who were a couple who was enslaved in Virginia, and they came to Des Moines around 1864. Their story is really interesting. They became really prominent community members. Henry was involved in local politics. Jenny was a suffragist, and they're both buried at Woodland Cemetery. And then finally, some future applications where this research can go in the future, plus maybe your own research. So as I mentioned earlier, I had the opportunity to learn about the Underground Railroad during my year of researching Woodland Cemetery. So we were researching it for nomination to the National Park Service Network to Freedom. This was a program that was founded in the 90s through an act of Congress, but basically it exists to preserve sites that have any kind of Underground Railroad association. Currently, there is over 700 sites preserved all across America. And the really cool thing about these nominations is that they're crowdsourced. So while the National Park Service does provide some government funding in order to grant funding for groups to apply to write these nominations, the National Park Service isn't writing them themselves. So normal people like you and me are able to write these, and they accept new nominations every year. The report, you basically have to provide a description of the site, then you have to verify the Underground Railroad Association. So for us, this was writing those biographies of the individuals. Then you include all your citations, pictures, all of that stuff. And then you submit it and you hear back. Luckily, we did our work through January through May of 2021. And then we got our acceptance in, I think it was September of 2021. So the program that I did this with was called Forever Free. It was started by Barry Jurgensen, who's the man on the far left in this photo. Originally, he did this with his high school history class, but then expanded the project out to include college students and high school students in other states. He originally started in Nebraska. So when I did this, I was paired with my mentor, Ricky King, who was on the far right, a local genealogist in Iowa. She runs her own freelance company out of Des Moines. And then in the middle, in the Iowa sweatshirt, is Maddie Kaysen, who was then a high school student. She now goes to University of Iowa. But basically we worked together, we were assigned a site, and throughout 5 months, we did all this research and then submitted our site for acceptance. So far, this program has admitted or nominated and been accepted 22 sites, I believe. And the reason that Barry started this program was to focus on sites in the Midwest because they're very underrepresented in the national listing. A lot of these sites are concentrated in the South and in the Northeast, but there are so many in the Midwest that are really fruitful for research. So you may be asking the question of why a cemetery would be eligible for nomination. If you guys are familiar with the National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Landmark Program, a lot of times they will not accept cemeteries because they will say like those are sites of individual remembrance of people after they die, but historical things don't really happen there. And surely no freedom seekers traveled through Woodland, at least that we know of. It wouldn't really be a site that would make much sense for freedom seekers to be occupying. But the Network to Freedom sees cemeteries as really powerful sites of remembrance where we can go and learn about Underground Railroad history. This is because a lot of Underground Railroad sites are either not preserved, they are no longer existing, they may be private residences we're not able to access. And so we need to work with what we have, especially in states like Iowa where Underground Railroad history isn't really recognized. We have to dig a little deeper to find sites where we can go and interact with this history. One of the other things that I think is really cool about cemeteries, particularly for remembering this history, is if we were to visit a house that operated as an Underground Railroad stop, or maybe another location where we know people traveled through, we'd get the story of one or two individuals. But when you travel through Woodland, you are seeing an actual network of these people all together. You're seeing them in one place and you can interact with all of their stories and see how they really interacted with each other during their life as well. Out of our 15 conductors and freedom seekers, we know that a lot of them did interact with each other. And I'll show this to you later in the presentation. Henry Bell interacted with Jefferson Logan and Isaac Brandt, who are also buried at Woodland. So it's really cool to just visualize that network in living time. Woodland is the oldest cemetery in Des Moines. It was founded in 1848, before Des Moines was even an established city or became the state's capital. And being the oldest cemetery in Des Moines, it's really just like walking through the city's history. When you go through on tours, the influential families and the founding fathers of the city are already recognized, but stories of freedom seekers have yet to be told. So once we know about Woodland, the question is, how did 15 known freedom seekers and conductors end up here in Des Moines? You guys may be familiar with some Underground Railroad history in Des Moines, but I'm just going to provide an overview of it anyways as context. And I really had to acquaint myself with this research when I was beginning because I did not know anything about it. Personally, I'm from Nebraska, so I knew a little bit about Iowa or about Nebraska's Underground Railroad history, but Iowa I really knew nothing about. Iowa became an incorporated territory in 1838, and 8 years later in 1846, Iowa became the 29th state. So Iowa was initially populated mainly by settlers from southern states who had pro-slavery democratic sentiments. You can see this kind of in the laws that were already emerging in the territory. Black codes, the first ones were established in 1839. These were in order to prevent the settlement of free African Americans into the state. So even while Iowa was quite pro-slavery in its beginning, southern Iowa saw an influx of northern settlers from Ohio, Illinois, and New England in the 1840s. These were highly religious communities, very anti-slavery, and they began to found anti-slavery societies, anti-slavery churches, and Underground Railroad stops along southern Iowa's border. This is because Iowa's southern border was shared with the slave state of Missouri. Missouri was considered quite a vulnerable slave state because of two reasons. Number one, only 12% of its population was enslaved. This is compared to the 33%, which was the national average. So really quite low slave population. And then also it's bordered by two active free states. We have Iowa and then we have Illinois. Chicago was a major destination for freedom seekers, which you'll hear a little bit about more. Let's see. So Iowa kind of gained this national reputation around 1848 for being a major destination for freedom seekers. There was a nationally publicized court case in which Missouri slave owner sued a bunch of abolitionists for helping freedom seekers. And by 1850s, really this influx of settlers from northern states and this publicized anti-slavery work was changing public opinion about slavery in Iowa. Other national events in the 1850s, such as the Fugitive Slave Law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Dred Scott decision, culminated in a spike of anti-slavery sentiment. This was helped by James W. Grimes, who was the third governor of Iowa. He was also an anti-slavery advocate. And with its close proximity to the slave state of Missouri, Iowa continued to be this land of refuge. One fact that I thought was really interesting was that in 1860, Missouri led every single state in slave losses. And a lot of this was due to all that work that was happening on the southern border. Quakers and Congregationalists were the main individuals who were operating these stops. Along the southern border, you have towns like Civil Bend, Amity, and Tabor, which were major stops along the Underground Railroad. Here we see one of these stops that's preserved. It's the Todd House Museum in Tabor, Iowa. And it's now preserved, operating as a museum. There's quite a few more down there. If you guys are familiar, I'm sure you can look them up online as well for visiting. But how we really come to our part of this that matters is that a lot of these Southern abolitionists would further send on freedom seekers up through Des Moines and then to freedom in Canada and Chicago. So the city of Des Moines, which I meant to put a circle on around here, but lower, kind of to the left, West Des Moines, as you can see it on there, is about 75 miles from the Iowa-Missouri border, and it served as this intersection of the different Iowa Underground Railroad routes up into Chicago and Canada. So Canada was a place where a lot of freedom seekers escaped to because it was a free nation. There wasn't slavery there. And then up to Chicago as well. So there are quite a few notable Underground Railroad stops in Des Moines. You guys may have heard of the Jordan House, which is now operated by the West Des Moines Historical Society. James Jordan was a really influential conductor on the Underground Railroad. He aided abolitionist John Brown, who you can see there on the right, on his last journey in 1859, before Brown was executed after the Harper's Ferry incident. Henry and Jenny Bell, who I'll talk about later, may have also traveled through the Jordan house. We only see this cited in one place, but it could be possible. It might even be probable. A lot of these freedom seekers didn't just go through Iowa, but ended up settling there for the rest of their lives. And during the Civil War, Des Moines also saw an influx of what at the time were called contraband settlers. So these were escaped slaves from the South. From the numbers that we know, there was 12 contraband settlers in 1860 to 72 of them in 1865. Another individual buried in Woodland named Jefferson Logan would be defined as one of these contraband settlers. He was helped by conductor Isaac Brandt, who was also buried at Woodland. So Des Moines really just did serve as this integral yet overlooked stop on the Underground Railroad, and there's a really rich history there to be uncovered. Okay, so that's kind of a lot of background information, but I think it is useful for moving forward. And so onto the, really the research process that we used after learning that Iowa background was first identifying freedom seekers and conductors buried at Woodland Cemetery. Second, verifying their involvement through primary source research. This was what was required by the report. We could use secondary sources, but if we did, they had to be backed up by a primary source. And then the third is writing these biographical narratives and bringing it all together. So our first step, locating individuals to research. If you already have an individual in mind who you know about, it's really easy. You can just locate when they're interned really quickly. But for us, this step came a lot later in our process because we didn't even have names of people that were buried here yet. The reason that we were interested in Woodland Cemetery was because an employee at the Network to Freedom knew that Delia Webster, who was an influential abolitionist, was buried at Woodland. So originally they wanted to just nominate Woodland because of Delia's association with it. But we decided to do a little bit more research, see if we could find any more individuals, and we did. So we relied really heavily on digitized newspapers, particularly obituaries of African Americans that were passing away in the late 19th and the early 20th century. This was a time when a lot of former slaves were passing away, their obituaries were popping up, and in those obituaries, it would note that they were either a fugitive slave, an escaped slave. The word freedom seeker did not exist at that time. Of course, that's what we use now, but the terms of that time would have been fugitive slave. So if you can see here, we located Henry Bell's name a little bit later, but a lot of newspaper articles and obituaries do pop up when we limit it to his name, the dates that we're looking for, and the city. So that would be Des Moines, Iowa. We also utilized publicly available information relating to the Underground Railroad. So the Iowa Freedom Trail Project was funded by the Network to Freedom. And I think it began in 2002, but basically what happened was that volunteers researched Underground Railroad people, abolitionists, freedom seekers in every single county in Iowa. And then they listed it by that county. So this was like a really, really rich resource for us because if you see here, we of course limited it to Polk County. And after each name, it has the city where they lived. So for us, we identified all of these people who were from Des Moines. It ended up that 5 of these abolitionists and 3 of the freedom seekers ended up being buried in Woodland Cemetery. So this was a really rich resource for us. And it's super useful as well. I think that it could, you could really replicate this in any other county in Iowa because this is such a great resource. It's on the State Historical Society of Iowa's website. You can also just look it up by searching Iowa Freedom Trail Project. Physically visiting the cemetery was kind of our last step for trying to identify a few more individuals. Woodland has a section for United States Colored Infantry and United States Colored Troops graves. So they're all the same design, so you can identify them pretty easily. But going through these gravestones can be really useful because a lot of the individuals who were parts of these troops they were freedom seekers or they were escaped slaves. So one of these, we can see Henry Shelley. He was buried in Woodland, and we were able to verify his Underground Railroad association as freedom seeker. So once we had this list of potential names, we were able to search whether they were buried at Woodland. So Des Moines operates, or the city of Des Moines operates a website called the City of Des Moines Cemetery Search. And when you look up a name, you are able to find some really useful information. So for us, if you see down on the bottom, we have Henry Bell. We got some really fruitful information. We were able to find his age at death, which would be 97, his date of interment, which was 1909, and then the block and lot number, so we could visit his grave, which there is a picture of later. So after a few rounds of this preliminary process, and that included eliminating a lot of people, we ended up with this list of 15 individuals. So we have 6 conductors, 5 freedom seekers, and then 4 individuals who we're pretty sure did travel through the Underground Railroad, but we didn't have enough time or primary source evidence to verify them. We did include them in our final report, hoping that someday we could go back or another team could go back and do more research on them, but we only had 5 months, so we focused on the 11 that we could verify. So with this list of names and interment dates in hand, we could begin our research process. So we were doing this at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, so we were really limited to online research. This really wasn't that much of a hindrance to us, actually. As you guys are probably aware, so much stuff is available online now. We were able to use all digitized records in order to do this. And I will be using Henry and Jenny Bell to kind of walk you guys through the research process that we did. The Bells were freedom seekers who settled in Des Moines, and their story and its preservation in newspapers can really show us a lot about how we can do this research. One note that I think is important to make is that Jenny Bell appears in a lot less records than Henry does. When she does, it's usually with her association with her husband. I think this kind of just reminds us of an important lesson that Black women continue to be pretty invisible in our archives and in our research that we do. So we just have to work a little bit harder to uncover their stories. So Find a Grave is another general launching point website for cemetery research. This database contains interment records from all 50 states, and then they're further divided by county, city, and cemetery. So we were able to search through Woodland. This website was important for us because it provided a little bit more information than just the City of Des Moines cemetery search. So you see here when we search Henry Bell, it also lists his birth, his death, the dates of those, where he's buried, what plot, and then users can upload photos, newspaper articles, and biographies. While this information isn't verifiable, well, it is verifiable, but this is all user uploaded, so we need to double check what's been uploaded there. But it does give us a really good starting point for trying to research a little bit further about this individual. So for this, we now suspected that Bell was born in Virginia in 1811 and that he died in Des Moines at the age of 97. And then we had a few newspaper articles that pointed us to more information about his life. You guys are probably familiar with Ancestry and Family Search. These are really important databases, and they're really useful. User uploaded documents. We have census records, marriage, birth, and death records. So a search for Henry Bell, once limited to his lifespan and the locations where we knew that he resided, produced a lot of documents. This one's really hard to read. It was digitized pretty poorly, but it was a 1905 census record from when he lived in Des Moines that verified a lot of information about Bell. So we have his full name, we have his address, then the age that he was that year. So in 1905, he was 93. We have the place of birth of his mother and his father, which was Virginia, how much his home was worth, which at the time was $1,200. It said that he spent 41 years in Iowa and that he was also widowed at that time. So we know that by then, Jenny had passed away. It also says that his occupation was as a laborer. We know that he engaged in farming for quite a while, but then he also picked up odd jobs. And then months unemployed in 1904 was 4 months. I'm presuming that this was because he was getting quite old, and at 93, it's a little bit harder to work. But he did work throughout his entire life. While Jenny also appeared in some census records, it was always being like her listed as Henry's wife. Let's see. So here is just a lot of the other newspaper articles that we used. Newspaper information is really, really useful for us because it tells us more of a story, but it also can be extremely frustrating. A lot of newspaper articles are extremely biased to present a specific viewpoint depending on what newspaper it was written for. At the time, there was a lot of pro-slavery versus anti-slavery newspapers, Republican versus Democrat, and even journalists themselves would have their own perspectives on what they were writing. One way that we see this crop up in Henry Bell's story is one journalist wrote that during his time of enslavement, Henry was the happiest slave who ever lived because he was motivated by love for his family and his masters were always kind to him. We know based on other information throughout Bell's life that he did suffer extreme abuse at the hand of his masters. And this happy slave myth was used by a lot of pro-slavery advocates to try to maintain that slavery was a useful institution, that slaves were happy in what they were doing, and they wanted to be enslaved. So when we see stuff like this pop up, we just need to be wary of it. So that's why it's helpful to know more about the historical context, because we can say, okay, that's probably not true. So let's see. A lot of the resources that we used were obituaries. However, Henry and Jenny were quite popular figures in Des Moines, so we do see other ones pop up throughout their lives. There was a really huge uptick in interest in the Underground Railroad in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So there are some feature articles where Bell is being interviewed about his time as a slave, which is really interesting and provided some really cool resources. So to get to the actual biography, the story of the Bell's lives was pieced together from over 20 primary source documents. The conflicting stories about the Bell's escape are particularly interesting because they show how difficult this research can be in verifying what actually happened. Still, even while we can't know everything about their lives, and this is only one story of freedom seekers, it's pretty representative of what a lot of freedom seekers went through. There's stories of family separation, abuse at the hands of their masters, and then the journey towards freedom, and finally settling in a free city. So Henry and Jenny did have, I would say, a success story. They lived very long, happy lives in Des Moines, but not all of the freedom seekers that even are buried in Woodland had that same experience. So Henry Bell was a freedom seeker born in he was born in Goose Creek, Virginia on September 12th, 1811. His mother and his father were both enslaved on a plantation owned by a man named Colonel Essick. So Henry's first last name was Henry Essick. It was customary at the time for slaves to take the last name of their masters. Around 1827, Henry was now 16, and his master sold him to his son-in-law, which his name was Tom Bobbins. Bobbins then moved them to Decatur, Alabama. So already we see Bell uprooted from Virginia, where his family was originally from, moved to Alabama. In Decatur, Henry then met his wife, Jenny, who lived on a neighboring plantation. This was pretty common. Slaves would often begin relationships with slaves on neighboring plantations. They did get married. We don't know if this was an official licensed marriage or if it was just a marriage that they, it was a marriage in name. A lot of times it was very difficult for slaves to find a pastor who would give them an official marriage, but we know that they did stay together for their entire lives, and other records say that they were legally married. And they had 16 children. So sometime later, Tom Bobbins decided that he wanted to move to Missouri because his wife had passed away. Stories go that Bell refused to go to Missouri because he did not want to be separated from his wife and his children. And that Bobbins was so moved by this expression of love that he sold him to a nearby other slave master and then moved to Missouri. We don't know whether this is true, but it does make for a really nice story. So Henry was then sold to Henry Bell, or no, James Henry, sorry. There's a lot of confusing names with this. But he was sold to James Henry, who was on a neighboring plantation. We do know that during his time at James Henry's plantation, he suffered extreme abuse at the hand of that master. He was often beaten for accusations of lying. He was whipped very often, and there are stories that he fled into the woods for up to 3 weeks in order to escape death at the hand of his master. Bell later remarked in his life that James Henry was the meanest man that he ever met. Another cool or interesting story from Henry's time of enslavement was in October 1862. We knew that he now lived on a plantation near Corinth, Mississippi, because he found himself in the midst of the Second Battle of Corinth, which happened on October 3rd and 4th in 1862. His cabin was between Union and Confederate lines, so he often encountered wounded soldiers. Reportedly, he fed and cared for them, notably helping those from the Iowa Infantry 7th Regiment. It's possible that his meeting with these Iowa soldiers was what later led him there when he decided to seek his freedom. Stories about Bell's escape are widely varied. It's pretty much accepted that the family left the South in 1864 when Henry was 53 and Jenny was 46, and then that they moved to Iowa. There's a few different stories of how they got there. One article says that they were freed during the Union occupation of Tennessee, which implies that Bell was living in Tennessee between 1862 and 1864. This is pretty unlikely, and we don't think it's a very accurate story, but it is in one newspaper article. Another one claims that Bell earned enough money to purchase his own freedom. One says that he was freed by the Lincoln Proclamation. But the most likely story, and the one that emerges in the most newspaper articles, is that he sought freedom on the Underground Railroad. There is one story, which you can kind of see here on the right, that Bell traveled through the Jordan House and then lived in Des Moines. So this shows the importance of doing a lot of research and locating as many articles as you can find, because if we only had one of them, the one that said maybe that he was freed in Tennessee, we would think that was the right story. And we can't really say which is the most accurate, but the one that does appear in most of them is that he traveled to the Underground Railroad. There's just a few more articles about the Bells throughout their lives. We can see another picture of Henry on the right. We do not have any pictures of Jenny, unfortunately, so far. It's possible that some of her descendants have some, but we didn't have time to locate them. Once in Iowa, Bell engaged in farming and Jenny labored at home, likely taking care of their 16 children. They lived for nearly all their lives in Des Moines at 1004 Fremont Street. Bell became a really beloved and well-known member of the community. You can see here on the left, him attending a picnic for the Colored Old Settlers Association. We see other people buried in Woodland Cemetery appear at this. Jefferson Logan and Isaac Brandt also attended meetings like this. And Jenny became a prominent suffragist. In January of 1888, the Polk County Women's Suffrage Association held a parlor meeting at the Bell residence. What's really cool about this was that both white and Black women attended, and this was in the late 1800s, so before we see anything even resembling an integrated suffrage movement. And a year later, they had another one there. She was known as one of the city's leading Black women, and another article referred to her as one of our oldest and most highly esteemed ladies of Des Moines. The couple was affectionately referred to in newspaper articles as Father and Mother Bell. And the number of articles about them really shows how important they were and how beloved they were by their community. One last interesting story about Jenny was that there's a newspaper article from 1895 where it shows that she was reunited with her brother, Salem Hampton, who she had been separated from when they were moved to different plantations back when she was a child 50 years ago. Jenny found out that Salem was now living in Texas, wrote a letter to him, and he came up and visited their family. So here we see a story of, a family reunited, which really didn't happen that often. It was really difficult for family members to locate one another once they were moved to separate plantations, especially if their names were changed. But it's a nice story that they were able to find each other again. However, in January of 1903, Jenny Bell did fall ill, and then she died on February 7th of 1903. Her obituary is there in the middle. In 1905, Henry's health also began to decline. A lot of people said that he never recovered from the death of his wife. There's one article that says that he may have had cancer. In 1909, he died at the age of 97 and was buried next to Jenny in Woodland Cemetery. A really large funeral was held. There's a lot of articles about it, and a lot of the other freedom seekers and conductors buried at Woodland were in attendance at that funeral. Here you can see their headstones. You can still visit these today. They're a little difficult to find because Woodland is very big and very poorly organized. But we were able to locate all 15 headstones. And just to think about what the Bell story can teach us. And I think first is that there is so much evidence that's waiting to be uncovered about these individuals. And it just is waiting there for people to tell these stories. We were able to piece together an entire biography of this family through just a few months of research, and before this story had never been told. I also think it's important for us to realize that physical spaces where we can interact with this history really matter a lot. Besides the Jordan House, which we don't even know if they really traveled through, Woodland is the only physical place where we can go publicly to remember the history of people like Henry and Jenny Bell, because their history isn't preserved in any other physical space. And I think that maybe you guys can attest to this as well, but you can read about something online on a blog post or in a book, but physically visiting that place and interacting with these graves can be really, really powerful. I think one last takeaway from their story is their story is repeated at least 15 times in this cemetery and probably more. Des Moines and Iowa have this really rich Underground Railroad history that is just waiting to be told. Just to talk a little bit about the future of cemetery research and where this can go in the future. There's always the possibility of adding more cemeteries to the Network to Freedom. The program that I worked with is partnering with the West Des Moines Historical Society and has funding for another round of applications. So I'm not sure if they're still seeking interns, but if you keep up with them on their website, you might hear more about it. There's so many more cemeteries and sites that can be added due to their association. The next thing is creating interactive ways for people to engage with this history. So it's all well and good that we did this report and we got it on this national listing, but how can normal people who are walking through the cemetery interact with it? So we were actually approached by a local filmmaker in Des Moines named Christine Bartley, who was doing this program called Woodland Cemetery Quest. What she would do was she would bring in local historians or descendants to film their stories about these people who were buried there. She would then upload these videos and make them accessible by a QR code at every grave. So me and Ricky recorded all 15 of our biographies. They were just recently published this summer. So if you walk through, you can scan these QR codes and you can learn about these people from some of the people who might know them best now. Finally, I think cemetery preservation is something that we don't often think about. Woodland Cemetery a few years ago was falling into disrepair. These are really old cemeteries. A lot of family members aren't going to visit them anymore. And so it's really important that we maintain them, keep them up. They started a volunteer program for cleaning off headstones, but it's really important to, make sure that we continue to invest in these cemeteries, advocate with our city councils for funding for them, to just keep up their maintenance and preserve them for the future. And finally, maybe there's some applications for your own research. I would encourage you guys to visit a cemetery that's important to you or a local cemetery, because there's a lot of fruitful research that can be done there. And I think making them into places that people can visit again and see as these historical spaces can be really powerful. I think a lot of people tend to regard cemeteries as places that you only go when you want to visit one of your family members. But back in the day, cemeteries were just regarded as parks and people would walk through them. And I think that can be a really powerful thing. And I think we should kind of bring back that idea. So that's kind of my presentation, my shtick about this research that I did. I'd be really happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. And I appreciate you all giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Yes.
Can you go back to the picture of the gravestone?
Yeah, so I was asked to go back to this picture of the headstones.
He was 97 years old, but the gravestone seems to indicate he was 107.
Yeah, that would be an error. We know that from multiple records that he was born in, I think, 1811. I don't know why that error is there. I actually never noticed that before, but that is incorrect. That would be interesting to try to figure out. He was not 107 when he died. So, yeah. Yeah, so there, the question was, where are the QR codes at Woodland Cemetery? So they're just printed out and laminated, and then they're stuck on some posts, and then they're stuck quite near to the grave, not on the grave, because that would be, disrespectful. But they're typically in front of it, and then you can just scan them on your smartphone, and it'll pull up the videos. I believe you can also just find them online by searching Woodland Cemetery Quest, but I'm not sure. I've only ever located them through the QR codes.
So there are a couple of questions from our audience on Zoom. So first, you mentioned religious or Christian communities such as Quakers and Congregationalists involved in anti-slavery action in Iowa with the Underground Railroad. Were there other religious or denominational groups that you came across in your research that came from Ohio, Illinois, New England, that settled in Iowa and were anti-slavery? What about the pro-slavery religious denominations from the South that settled in Iowa? What were some of those groups?
I feel like one of the other ones that we also encountered that was pro-slavery were Presbyterians, but I could be wrong about that. Really, the ones that we encountered a lot were the Congregationalists and the Quakers who populated those southern Iowa towns. Pro-slavery religious groups, I don't think I could name any. I'm sure that they did exist, but really what we were focusing on by the time of, the 1850s was these southern cities that were mainly dominated by anti-slavery groups. I really don't think there was much pro-slavery activity in those cities anymore. I'm sure if you look through them individually, they have their own divisive history of what was going on pro-slavery versus anti-slavery. But the important thing is that there was this really big tide of religious anti-slavery support in southern Iowa, which changed electoral politics, it changed popular opinion. And that was really what we focused on, but I'm sure there's a lot of good research to be done there as well.
So second question, did the records indicate why Henry Bell changed his name to Bell or how he came up with the surname of Bell? Were there any records indicating that extended family members accompanied Henry and Jenny along the Underground Railroad, or extended family members who remained in Virginia or any other state?
So there is the possibility that Bell changed his name to Henry Bell, because we are pretty sure that at one time Jenny was enslaved on a plantation owned by a man with the last name of Bell. It's possible that Henry was eventually sold to that slave owner as well and then changed his name, but we have no other indicator of where that last name would have come from. There's no newspaper articles about it. Obviously, he doesn't appear in census records before 1864, before he was settling in Des Moines. As for extended family, we did not have the time to really research, possible descendants or where his extended family was. But it doesn't really appear in any of the records that he traveled with anyone else or with any other family members. We know that their children came and Jenny came. But yeah, we can't really locate any information about that. It might be there, but most of the stuff that we have is from later in his life, where he's recounting the main events of his journey from slavery to freedom. So we don't hear much about his other family members. Is there any other questions? Yeah.
Underground Railroad implied they were hidden as they traveled. Yet when they arrived in Des Moines, there's nothing about them being hidden, but living openly on Fremont Street. That seems out of context.
Yeah, so the term Underground Railroad, a lot of scholars are actually trying to get away from it because it does imply that there was always this secrecy, and the railroad idea doesn't really apply so much anymore, which is why the National Park Service and a lot of other scholars have embraced this term network to freedom rather than Underground Railroad. So we do know that he was escaping from slavery was probably, at the threat of slave catchers. But as far as we know, Des Moines was quite open to Black settlers by, the late 1860s. And so Bell and his family did settle here. It's possible that they, for a time, were still hidden. But as far as we know, they pretty quickly settled into Des Moines and became really important figures in local politics and local life. I think what that tells us about Des Moines is that its atmosphere was really welcoming to freedom seekers. There was a lot of people there who were willing to help them get employment, to get housing. So I would say once they were here, they might have encountered some troubles. It doesn't really say in the sources, but they were able to settle here, live really open lives, and they were, highly publicized in newspapers and stuff like that, which shows that, they weren't hiding anymore.
Are there any known descendants of the Bell family?
The question is if there are any known descendants of the Bell family in the Des Moines or Iowa area. We don't know. We didn't have enough time to research that, and it also wasn't really the main focus of our research. I'm sure that we could find out. There are a lot of articles about their children, so we could trace that, and I bet a lot could be done there. We were able to locate the descendants of Delia Webster, who was one of the conductors buried at Woodland. She was the first woman who was imprisoned for abolition work, which is really interesting. While she didn't do any work in Des Moines or Iowa, I believe she was in Ohio. She was buried in Woodland. So we were able to locate her descendants, and they provided us with some new pictures that had never been seen before, one from when she was quite young. So sometimes we came across descendants in our research, but that really wasn't the main focus of it, although I'm sure that information could be found. Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate this opportunity. I hope maybe you learned a little bit something. My contact information is on the last slide, and I'm sure if you guys have any further questions, want to hear more about the program, the library could provide it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Allie. Just as a reminder to everyone, next month we will be in person only. We will not have a virtual option because we'll be streaming an episode of Finding Your Roots here in the library's auditorium. So I hope to see everyone next month.
You mentioned 22 sites. that
Mhm.
you looked at.